Hello, everyone. My name is Selena Hill. I'm a multimedia journalist and the host of the Branding in the Age of Black Lives Matter virtual series here on Social Media Week Plus. Thank you so much for joining me for the fourth episode titled Actions Speak Louder Than Words. As we know, public support of Black Lives Matter has spiked in light of ongoing protests over police violence and calls to end systemic racism. As a result, today's consumers are using their voice and their dollars to demand justice and are calling on multinational brands to take action in the fight to dismantle structural racism. Silence from brands is unacceptable. However, the wrong statement or action could be just as detrimental. On today's episode, I'm speaking with two marketing and communication experts about the best practices for brands to reach and empower communities of color during this polarizing time of social unrest. First up, we have multicultural marketing expert Courtney McKenzie Newell, who is the founder and CEO of Crown Marketing and Communications. Hi. I'll also be speaking with Kai D. Wright, who is the author of Follow the Feeling, which reveals branding secrets based on research from 1,500 of the fastest growing companies. Kai is also the curator and publisher of Blacklist 100 and a global consulting partner at Ogilvy's. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
So happy to have you here with us today. So I actually want to just jump into this conversation by asking, how has the resurgence of the global Black Lives Matter movement really shifted consumer expectations of brands?
So I would just say the first thing that I've noticed is that brands now are really paying attention because they're being held accountable. Years ago, brands could say something, they could have an internal message, they could post something on their website, but now consumers are really demanding change. They're only supporting brands, or they're geared more towards supporting brands that are actually making a difference and committing to change. Not just saying, we'll donate this amount of money to the NAACP, but really saying this is what we're going to do in addition to that. While that's a great step, we're really holding brands accountable. And there's lists of thousands of companies that don't support or were silent in the time of in the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And then there are brands that were very vocal and pushed the envelope with their stance on it. And so those brands are seeing the support in the sense of Black dollars. And so I think it's very important for brands to be mindful of what they're doing and what they're not doing also.
Absolutely.
And I agree with Courtney. There is a heightened sense of awareness of what Black Lives Matter is right now. And that sense of awareness is creating a need for CEOs, for chief marketing officers, and for many other executives at companies to have a response, at least to acknowledge the situation, the context at which employees are showing up and being productive under. And to build on Courtney's point around brands and what they've been doing, in June, following George Floyd's death, I've been tracking 85 different companies that have released a public statement. Most of the public statements we found through our analysis, whether it's Diageo or Levi's or Nordstrom or McDonald's or the NFL, most are being made by a CEO or C-suite executive. Most involve some form of a donation that's being made, or other commitment in terms of hiring practices, bringing individuals along the journey in terms of representation, or a commitment to just listening and investing in different communities. Regardless of what the commitment is, what I think many people are curious to see is action. And so we saw this huge groundswell of those statements being made, Black squares being posted on social media as a show of solidarity, 1,000 companies that signed up for Stop Hate for Profit. But what we really are waiting for are those brands that are going to be the leaders. Because if we think back, Selena, Black Lives Matter started in 2013 formally, right? The hashtag first appeared in 2012 after Trayvon Martin. But if you really thought about what brands have been championing Black Lives Matter before June of 2020, I think most people would be remiss to name a handful. And so a lot of the brands that have engaged have just engaged and just shown up from a substantive standpoint.
And, to your point, and thank you for, giving us that research and that data point that you referenced. Do you think that the brands that are just now showing up in 2020, how is that resonating with consumers? Because like you said, Black Lives Matter started formally in 2013. There was a huge resurgence in 2014 and 2015 after the deaths of Mike Brown and Eric Gardner. This is, this is a play of events that we're seeing over and over. Now it's 2020.
Well, as a, just quick follow-up, there's a certain sense of urgency that I think exists now than before, because brands are also realizing that they're late to the conversation. And with this being an election year, I think it creates election year plus a pandemic. It creates an even greater need for brands to be willing and open to flowing towards the issues that the communities of color are most being impacted by. And so I think there's a large level of flexibility brands are going to have this year. Some brands are getting it right. Some brands are getting it wrong. But I've really been encouraged also by a lot of the movement of people and been really impressed by some of the groups of individuals that have come together in advertising, like 600 Rising, or some of the other people-led initiatives like 15% that have led brands like Sephora to commit to 15% of their shelf space going to Black entrepreneurs, and a number of other companies that have signed on that challenge. And so right along kind of brands committing, I would say there's a number of people who are actually taking action that I think are going to encourage and push brands to do more even faster.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say to that, Selena, also, one thing that is different in this resurgence versus 2014 or 2015 is that it's no longer, Black Lives Matter back then was seen as a Black issue, and now it's a global issue. People are actually saying, oh my gosh, I identify, I get it now. And it took all of these many years and all these different events of occurring for people to really understand what the movement was, and knowing, hey, this is not a violent organization. It's not this, it's not that. This is what it really is. And I think the reason that so many brands were silent back then is brands were there's very little diversity in media as it is. So those brands that are leading the marketing, leading the advertising, leading the communications for these global organizations, they were just trying to play it safe, or they didn't feel affected or impacted by it. So now when you have various communities of color and communities not of color really supporting this movement, brands have no option. It's like almost holding them down and saying, hey, if you don't pay attention, we're going to make sure that you pay attention. So it's no longer a Black issue, although it never was just a Black issue. It's now a humanity issue, and now people can't help but pay attention. And those that are staying silent, they know now that they're on the wrong side of history.
Thank you for that, Courtney. And, well said. Speaking of that, can you actually recall a recent either digital or social media campaign, initiative, or statement from a brand that you felt successfully connected with those of us who are marching in the streets, those of us who are aligned with the values and the principles of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Absolutely. I think the Coca-Cola company did a great job with their statement. It came directly from the CEO, James Quincy, and he was very clear on his positioning. He was very clear on what they were doing going forward. And they've announced not only just ways that they're going to make sure that they're making an impact internally, but also externally, and not just for 2020, because a lot of brands have, put a Band-Aid over the issue by saying, we'll donate to this organization. But I think that they did a great job because they've made a commitment that goes beyond 2020 and for years and years to come. So I think that they did an exceptional job, and it's continuing, and I've been following it to continue to see the impact and the statements that they're making, and it's really coming from the top down versus just coming from the supplier diversity department. So I think that speaks volumes.
You know, Kai, when you were speaking, you talked about the brands that were posting up the black square and those that are very new to this space. But I do want to just, take some time to give credit for the brands that are maybe doing it right, and are really trying to align themselves with Black Lives Matter and show up as an ally from a corporate sense. Can you recall a brand that did something very recently and you felt like the messaging was really effective and it really hit home?
Sure. So one of the pleasures that I have as, in addition to consulting is being a lecturer at Columbia. And as a lecturer, I do a lot of independent research and a lot of studies. And so we launched a study at the beginning of September. It was fielded in the United States with 1,006 Americans over the age of 18. And then we did a second sample size of 500 Black Americans over the age of 18. And we asked them what brands are getting it right, what brands are not getting it right. And at the beginning of September, there were some that they felt were resonating with them. The holistic approach that the NBA is taking, the way that they are empowering their players and the players are using their own platforms, the way that the NBA is not restricting players in terms of uniform or what they're able to introduce in terms of the court, building it into the fabric of the way they're operating by actually imprinting that reminder on the court for individuals to see if Black Lives Matter every night. So they're taking it from being purely social from a post standpoint to a conversational moment and creating a lot of these opportunities for individuals to have a conversation. Some other brands that are getting it right are in places like Procter Gamble. Procter Gamble went one step further from making a commitment, and they wanted to really, have a somewhat first mover advantage within the June timeframe. And so they partnered with the multicultural agency, Wright, who produced a television ad spot within 1 week. And it really focused on kind of how we have conversation. And they created a website that was an anti-racism website that made it very clear not only what their statement was from a PR standpoint, but what resources were, what benchmarks they were setting, what quotas they were setting. So I think they did a really good job of trying to create a set of branded content that could live on YouTube, live in social, live in .com, that would really set a line of expectation of what other larger brands should be doing. And the NBA, I think, as a brand, is very culturally relevant and shows how you can use that platform from a pop culture standpoint to address a social issue. And Procter & Gamble is a more classical master brand holding company, global in nature. So to really show how to use that scale. And I think those are two kind of opposite ends of examples, but really well resonated with in terms of audiences.
Kai, I'm really happy you brought up the NBA as an example, because I had two conversations very recently, one with former player Rasheed Wallace and one with Steven Jackson, who we know was a lifelong friend of George Floyd and has become an activist and a leading figure in the Black Lives Matter movement now. Both of them told me when they were playing, they were not happy with the NBA, the culture. Steven Jackson a few years ago made a song where he called the NBA a cotton field, and basically said it's a new age plantation. When I spoke to Rasheed Wallace and I said, well, they're going to allow the jerseys to change, you can use messaging, and it kind of felt like to me he said that's still not enough. I say that to say that to your earlier point, these brands were aware of the discontent that many of the employees, the workers, whatever, who, were speaking up. People internally were speaking up for a long time. And a lot of people are saying, why did it have to take George Floyd dying on camera? Do you think that there is any disconnect with these organizations that are getting into this space and taking great initiatives, and its way it's being received, to those of us who've been paying attention the whole time?
The short answer is yes. When we look at the amount of revenue and the number of customers that many of these large companies have, and compared them against the statements that were made. We did some pretty interesting things. We took all the language, ran it through text analysis, and developed a list of the top commitments that were being made. Now, most organizations have said that they will make donations, right? And so if you're thinking of these kind of large corporations, usually the amount was between $5 and $25 million that was being committed. The NBA, I think, made a $300 million commitment. They have some other commitments that they're doing. And that's not to say that they've gone above and beyond where other brands are. That's to say, when you look at the amount of money that companies make versus the commitment that they have made, it is not proportional yet.
Well, that being said, Courtney, a number of brands have suffered from marketing mistakes, PR disasters since George Floyd's death, and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. We've seen Starbucks, number of missteps. Started back in 2018 when they arrested 2 young Black men for sitting there. They still had a misstep this year. Taco Bell, another example. So I wanted to talk to you about how are these mistakes still happening, number one, and if you noticed how these brands are turning off millennials and other people of color.
Absolutely. So the reason why it keeps happening is the same reason why it's always happened and why these companies have really missed the mark when it comes to reaching multicultural, millennial and Generation X and baby boomers and really all of the generations, is because they don't have they don't have leaders in diverse positions. They don't have diverse leaders in positions where they can make those decisions. And so if you have an ad campaign or you have communications and you're speaking to a group of multicultural millennials, you really have to think twice about the messaging that you use. You have to think about, is this going to be offensive? Is there any possible way that this can be misconstrued, misunderstood? And we've seen this with Trader Joe's recently had a mishap where they started to label their some of their different brands like Trader Ming's. And there were people who were very offended by that. When we did the research to find out who actually made those decisions, there was no diversity on the decision-making board. And so that's going to continue to happen if brands don't really have those partnerships with diverse multicultural audiences and agencies. They're going to continue to have those problems. We saw an example of this with the Dove beauty brand when they had the white woman or the Black woman take off her shirt and become a white woman. That was offensive to a lot of people. And historically, that's very offensive, but there was and it was a national campaign. So there had to be multiple people who okayed that before it ever was seen by us, by the media. I mean, by just anyone in general. And so it's going to continue to happen if brands don't really focus on, hey, if we're going to have an ad that's targeted to the Black community, maybe we should actually invest in or partner with a multicultural agency. There are a ton of well-established ones. There are some that, like our company, that focuses on multicultural millennials. There are so many, but the brands are sticking to the companies that they've consistently worked with for years. And they're going to continue to get it wrong if they don't make a change, both internally and externally.
And just to build from Courtney's last point in terms of, I agree with everything Courtney said, but to build from that last point in terms of why representation matters, we can't just adopt general market or general population messaging. Sometimes the whole expression of how the brand shows up and engages with the audience just needs to be different. There are different needs and different values from different communities and tribes. And sometimes that way that the brand shows up isn't the matching luggage of a television spot. It may be solving some other issue that individuals in that audience are facing. One of the challenges that I've seen, and I think will be consistent as we move forward, unfortunately, is brands that don't have their own truth and reconciliation about their past. And so we're not just talking about the Uncle Bens or Aunt Jemimas of the world that are going through the process of changing their names and packaging and really dealing with the kind of deep reflection of their heritage, but also a number of different companies that have done things that have been harmful or less than um, um, empowering for certain groups. So I think of L'Oreal most recently. They were a brand that in June came out very vigorously in terms of their commitments. But then Monroe Bergdorf, who was a transgender model, reminded them of getting dropped from a campaign years ago, and that their commitment starts with the influencers that they work with, the content creators that they're empowering, the media that they're buying. And it adds another layer that brands have to not only look to the future, but remember that communities are not going to be short-sighted in terms of the role that brands may have played in creating part of the issues that we have today when it comes to race or social justice or equality in terms of how people are represented and empowered in media.
Yeah, no, excellent point. And Courtney, I actually want to just double down a little bit, because we did see Uncle Ben's and Aunt Jemima in particular taking drastic measure to change the imaging that they were putting out for generations. I would be remiss to think they did not know the history behind it. However, it's 2020, and a lot of people are saying enough is enough. What was your thoughts when you found out about Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, and these historic brands that have, again, just used racial stereotyping to promote their products?
Well, growing up, I always knew those stories. My parents emphasized knowing Black history, Black culture, knowing what brands supported our culture, celebrated our culture, versus just playing a hip hop song in a commercial and saying, hey, this is for buy my products, Black people. And so I knew the story of Aunt Jemima from, I don't know, when I was maybe like 6 or 7, remembering hearing that story, and still, unfortunately, or just out of few options available, still supporting that brand with my dollars because I still wanted that product. But I think now we're making more conscious decisions, and a great thing that I'm seeing happen out of this Black Lives Matter resurgence, and also brands not doing enough, we're supporting our own brands. We're creating our own brands, and we're supporting our own brands. So I think that those stories, and creating our own stories with our own voices, I think that is something that I'm seeing more and more of, and we're all sticking together as a community and supporting our own brands, creating our own brands, and then also supporting those brands and those companies that are actually hearing what we're saying.
Yes, no, for sure. Absolutely. So, speaking of brands that had some missteps, we know that Wells Fargo CEO, he was actually criticized for stating in a meeting and in a memo that the company is unable to meet its diversity goals because, and I quote, there is a very limited pool of Black talent to recruit from. Kai, I wanted to really just set this question up using an example like that and ask, how can a company or a brand be redeemed when in 2020 it seems like they're still just saying things that are very offensive and just set them back?
Got to take a sigh on this one, because over the summer, one of the things that I wanted to do with larger companies, and I work for one that produces 1 in 5 communication that lives out in the world, WPP. And so the responsibility is there for leaders at every level to think about how they can improve communication, improve culture, and improve the environment that everyone's working in. Can they be redeemed? Yes, they have to be redeemed. One of the pieces of research that we conduct is we asked individuals whether or not they believe in cancel culture. And if someone or an organization does something that's wrong, do they believe they should get canceled? Now, 90% of the individuals that responded in the survey said they should be canceled. But when we think about banks, when we think about the economics of America, you're going to find some similar sources of revenue that are going to be unsavory in terms of the banks and how they made money and stayed afloat over the last couple of 100 years if they're owed one or acquired older banks. And so many organizations that are part of America's DNA is going to have some level of redemption that they're going to have to do. We're learning that a lot with the institutions within academia, of a lot of universities having this reconciliation as brands. And what they're doing is renaming buildings and changing things left and right. We see this with institutions like the Met, in terms of wings that may be named after certain families. Those changes in the museum world is also taking place right now. So I think we're going to have to force a sense of truth to come out from these CEOs, that their own thinking has been implicit and also, I think, destructive to the culture of trying to even go and solve the problems. When a CEO like Wells Fargo's makes a statement like that, it only empowers and emboldens people below to say, well, look, if they affirm that it's difficult, then it must be difficult. But one of the reasons I created the Blacklist 100 was to immediately counter people like that. It was an argument that we could see and have heard before and knew it was going to pop up with urgency, that individuals were going to claim there were not in people who could do the jobs. And so with Blacklist 100, we took 3 weeks to identify 100 individuals. It was incredibly difficult because there were so many more. We have, Black Association for MBAs, for journalists, for engineers, for architects, for so many different professions, that to say a comment like that is, it's more than implicit bias. I think implicit bias intends a sense of passiveness. It's a level of carelessness that I don't think can be easily explained as just ignorance. It is, it's the statement in itself, I would say, is divisive and isn't in the spirit of trying to reflect the best of America, but try to make excuses for why certain individuals have what others should be able to have a chance to get.
Now, Courtney, the CEO of Wells Fargo, he actually put out a statement apologizing. I think what he said was he said it was unconscious bias. Kai just talked about implicit bias. Is a statement like that enough to acknowledge the implicit bias that he has and how it was, affecting him in his workspace? And also, second part to that question is, if it's not enough, what else can or should these brands be doing so that they can be redeemed?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is it's a first step. Is it enough? No, but I think it's the first step because you have to acknowledge that there is a bias, whether it be implicit or unconscious. You have to make sure that you at least are acknowledging that there is some sort of bias. And the thing that they can do and that they should do is they should be creating, and we've been working with a few Fortune 500 brands to do this, but really identifying top talent that they can develop. The problem that a lot of these brands will continue to have is that typically the person who you mentor, the person who's going to take your spot is that you're grooming to take your position. They typically look like you. You have similar stories that make you feel connected. And if we're not able to have our fair shot and have that door open to us as a community of color, then we'll always be the person having to fight that much harder to get in the door. And so these organizations really have to be thinking about ways that they develop, and they're creating these mentor protege programs so that they can really develop and identify top talent in a way that, you may not have a similar story to your mentor who is Hispanic or who is Black, but you will have some things and you'll know that this person is qualified. I think that a lot of people are thinking, and to what Kai said, the CEO of Wells Fargo really put it out there. And now whether even though he retracted his statement and came out saying that he has this bias and it was unconscious bias, there's still going to be people, that soundbite is already out there. So there are people who are going to hold on to that and they're going to continue to say that. And we've already had this problem, and not just internally, but as an entrepreneur and working with brands and trying to get into working with brands, we see this all the time, and really advocating for brands to diversify their supply chain. So this is going to continue to be a problem unless there are really programs and initiatives that are geared towards developing talent, because sometimes that talent needs to be developed either way, no matter what demographic you come from, but it has to be a concerted effort, and that's going to be the first step, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add to the points that you guys made, you're absolutely right, because that type of sentiment definitely sets the tone of inferiority that I think that a lot of us who are working in corporate America already feel and face every single day. And then to hear it from the top down, it's like, well, like you said, it reaffirms and it justifies that type of racist thinking. But I do want to just switch gears to talk about something that I really want to talk about: politics. Do you think, Kai, these brands should be chiming in the 2020 election? For instance, the debates, should they be, tweeting or live tweeting during the debate? Should they take a stance? And, if so, how high are the risk factors?
Well, what we know is the risk just got astronomically higher as of last week with the new executive order, right? And so I think brands that are well-intentioned and wanting to recognize the history of the US and the roots of inequality in an attempt to create an atmosphere and culture that is conducive for everyone to feel as if their diversity is being celebrated and they have an opportunity to be included. The executive order from September 22nd made it a challenge by making, I think, many companies second guess how to move forward. And so it will be interesting to see which companies have the boldness to counter and to speak up and speak out against that direct political, I think, attack on diversity and equity and inclusion efforts, which includes not only race, but also anti-sexism. And so that's going to be the first major thing. I think Black Lives Matter is going to be another major thing, which we've already seen a number of companies already affirm support for. When we look at other issues, companies have set a precedent of speaking out against them. Immigration, for instance. In a couple of years ago, I believe it was 2017, the only thing in the Super Bowl, not only thing, but one of the big themes of the Super Bowl from a politics standpoint were anti-immigration laws that were being passed at the time, restricting travel into the country. Microsoft had an ad, Airbnb had advertising and social media content that was running. And so we're going to see more and more employee activism. Right. Google employees got up and walked out over pay equity issues. And also we've had, Wayfair employees that protested sending mattresses to, the Border Patrol in terms of different locations of where families were being held. And so the notion that we're going to be able to separate the values of employees versus what a company does, which is comprised of employees. I think we're moving away from that mindset. And a lot of the research, what we see is that Gen Z and millennials specifically are the two generations digging their heels in and saying, we will not separate our values from our work. And we have other companies right now in this election period. There's a popular petition that was set up for electionday.org, which basically is trying to get companies to give their employees time off to vote. And 600 companies have agreed to do that. Major companies from Lyft to Airbnb, Walmart, a number of organizations that said they will make sure that individuals understand they can exercise their freedoms. At the same end, we have companies, and this is the last example that I'll give, that are saying they don't want to be the center of political engagement, but rather than leaving their employees kind of in a place to mentally be frustrated, Coinbase, the new cryptocurrency exchange, what they've done is they're offering severance packages. And so the CEO within the last week said, we are not going to be political. We will be apolitical as an organization. Anyone who has a problem with that can get a 4-month severance package and leave the organization. So it'll be interesting to see how things progress and move forward. But to answer your question, absolutely, I don't see how we can separate or comfortably ask employees to separate their treatment outside of work from the conditions inside work. I think they're all interrelated.
Mm. Courtney, before we really delve into Trump's executive order that Kai just mentioned, I do also want to get your thoughts about brands chiming into the 2020 election and getting political. We know that they're taking a strong stance when it comes to social justice issues, but should they chime in when it comes to politics as well?
I think the brands that are really, well, I think there are two parts. I think the first thing is brands really have a decision to make on what their stance is going to be, what their legacy is going to be, because I will say millennials and Gen Z are not as forgiving as previous generations. And so it really is going to stand true on where were you, where did you stand when it came to social justice, when it came to equality, when it came to the 2020 election. So brands do have a decision to make, and those brands that are bold enough, like Kai was saying, the ones that are bold enough to stand up and take a stance, they will reap great rewards, not just in 2020, but for the next 10 years and the many years after that, because that will be their legacy. And right now, brands that are standing up, we're seeing them have a huge, they're yielding huge results with that, because people are really feeling that they actually care and that they're willing to put their money on the line, essentially, by losing some of their customer base, but really positioning themselves to they're not just caring about their bottom line now, they're really caring about their legacy. And so I think that the brands that do decide to make that stance, it is very important to make sure that they do it carefully, but it's very important for them to just be clear on the pros and the cons of their brand. And it'll be different for every brand. There's some brands that are going to be very conservative and say, we're not going to enter into the ring. We're not going to make any statements. And then there are going to be some that are going to feel like they're forced to do so. So I think that it's a very personal decision for brands, but I will say that this is now a legacy making year. This is a legacy making time, and the brands that are bold enough, they will reap the rewards for years and centuries to come.
And one more thing that I just want to add to build on to Courtney's point, which is when you think about that legacy that brands are going to be held against, I mean, we know that history is going to judge this moment. Absolutely. It's going to judge not only the politicians and what they did, what they advocated for, but it will judge each of us as individual actors and citizens. And so brands are not going to be exempt from that. Corporations make donations. Corporation votes with those donations that they're making privately. So the notion that publicly they will not say something is, I think, fleeting. I'll give two kind of really quick examples of how brands have had a major impact. And the first one, a couple of years ago, Merck's CEO, who is one of only 3 African-American CEOs, 3 or 4, I think it's 3. At the time, it was only 3 African-American CEOs of Fortune 100 companies. When Charlottesville happened, he denounced it. He was very strong and very early. And there was a president's council of other CEOs that because he pulled out of it, the whole council disbanded, I believe, within 48 hours. And that is, I think, the power of leadership that's going to be needed is for those companies that have made those Black Lives Matter statements. They're now going to have to go all the way. And going all the way and finishing what they started means they don't just get the credit of making the statement and proclamation or commitment, but actually fulfilling it, right, and satisfying those requirements. And that means they may have to push against legislation, as we've seen certain companies do with LGBTQ rights, right? A number of companies gave money to actually change the law or gave resources to change the law. And so the only way a company can give is not just a donation, not just hiring. They have other levers that they can pull from a government regulation standpoint, also a media standpoint, even, right? How many companies will we see that may give free media space, whether it's digitally or whether it's on air, in order for more diverse perspectives to get out around the election also? So there's a number of different ways that brands can be involved, including giving days off. So my expectation is brands are going to do it. The last example I want to give was Nike. When Nike came out with their Dream ad featuring Colin Kaepernick, and people started burning the jerseys, and that was kind of, I think, Nike's moment to double down in terms of what they stood for as a brand. And a lot of companies looked to see financially if it was going to be worth it. And Nike's stock initially slid, and now it's trading 50% above where it was at that moment in time. So I think, just to reinforce what Courtney said, it may look like a brand may be taking a step back because of backlash that it's going to get. But when they continue to push forward, I think what they're going to see, just like all those brands that supported LGBTQ rights or supported different women's rights, they will end up on the right side of history.
Speaking of the right side of history and taking a step back, as we mentioned, Trump did sign this executive order putting a ban on diversity training in corporate America. Courtney, from your perspective, what type of impact will this have on brands? And again, not only internally, but externally, the messaging and the marketing that they're putting forward in the world?
Well, I think that the brands that I'm working with and the brands that I'm having conversations with, we work a lot with supplier diversity departments within Fortune 500 companies. And the things that I'm hearing and seeing are that there's no stopping them. What's going to happen is diversity and inclusion or diversity training is just going to be rebranded as something else, because they know the importance of these different components of education that a lot of people otherwise won't ever get access to. So brands are pushing forward because they know that it's important to them. Now, will it be under the name of diversity training? Possibly not, but they are going to find different ways to make sure that they're still meeting their goal of educating themselves and their consumers through diversity training. I mean, it's so important because the workforce is only getting more diverse. So imagine if a company or companies across the world decide to just put an X out on that. They're going to end up really finding themselves in a precarious situation, because they're not going to know how they should message, how they should craft their communications. They're not going to know the different things that are very important for some cultures versus others. So there's going to be the brands that are continuing to focus on that are going to be the brands that win. And what I'm seeing and hearing is that while it may be something that is being banned, there are already policies in place for some brands, and they're going to continue to push forward with that.
Good to know. Well, Kai, as we start to bring this conversation to a close, I do just want to take some time to talk about what advice you're giving, corporations or would give when it comes to developing a marketing strategy or best practices that would reach and empower communities of color. And, within that, I see a lot of companies reacting to police violence against Black and brown bodies, right? Sometimes they'll put out a tweet or, but I can only imagine the internal conversation they're having, because on one hand, you don't want to alienate a certain base, or maybe you do, I don't know. Or on another hand, you don't want to rush to judgment. The video comes out, but that's not a verdict. So how can brands navigate within this space and be authentic to who they are, but still empower communities of color?
Yeah, really good question, because often when we are in rooms with executives or conducting research or, just in different peer groups, whether it's summits or conferences, events, just kind of sharing, we hear of a risk that that you just mentioned, Selena, that CEOs either they don't want to alienate or they don't want to create the frequency of having to say something every single time because it happens so often. So if they start down the path of recognizing one crime, does that mean they have to do it for a number of times? There are some very actionable things I think individuals should keep in mind. To build on the point that Courtney made, it is a growth imperative in terms of solving issues of DE&I inside and making sure that communities that products and services are being sold to are better off also. That is a kind of ethical, conscionable stance that I think a number of companies have to lean into. And as Courtney said, it is a choice. That's what it's going to come down to. And that choice is going to mean a lot of lost revenue for companies that don't get it right. One of the individuals that I heard speaking recently was Monique Nelson, who is the CEO and chair of Uniworld Group. And they handle marketing for the US Census to make sure that multicultural audiences are measured at the appropriate rates that they should be so that communities get the funding that they need. And one of the things that she has started letting individuals know is that within the next 40 years, the majority of growth, 90% of growth in terms of demographics and people in the US is going to come from three groups. It's going to come from Asian American, Latinx, and African American. So you will simply not survive as a company if you think that you can only sell to the general population. The general population will become the niche, right? And we will have this flip of the majority multicultural. So we are moving towards that majority multicultural reality already. We may be there as soon as 2025, right? I think the 2020 census is going to reveal that we've gotten incredibly closer. But by 2030, that flip is expected and it's going to continue for a number of different decades. And so it's a growth imperative. Companies have to make that choice if they want to survive. And that choice means they're going to have to be systems-based in terms of their thinking. It's going to require holistic thinking, not just messaging externally, not just town halls internally. It's going to take action. And in order for that action to be pretty measured, there's a couple of different areas that they can think about, right? What are the right people? I think Courtney mentioned that a lot, right? Who's on the team, who's in leadership. So they have to recast individuals internally and spokespeople, influencers, and media outlets, right? They have to re-envision a who in terms of voices that are part of the equation. But they also have to think about practices, policies, and procedures, protocols, all those behaviors and ways of working inside of an organization that can disadvantage a group. For instance, performance reviews, right? Who is setting the standard language of what performing at a certain level means? We have to look at the system from that standpoint. And then we got to put in place a number of different programs at different companies. And those programs, I think, are going to be more reform based. So the issues and the challenges that are hardest to solve, I think those are going to need more attention, more resources. Initially, that may look like hiring and recruitment, kind of pipeline, where people are coming in from. That's what I imagine, Wells Fargo is going to be working on, as well as professional development programs. We've put professional development programs in place for women. Over the last couple of years, we should build from there. And, just to round out, I think the last thing that companies are really going to have to do from every single department, from top down, is lean into this notion of community, lean into this notion of tribe. We often think of audiences and employees as kind of just this blob of demographic data, right? Kind of code empty. But we're moving to this age with technology and social media where people are very dynamic. Things are very fluid. They change very fast. The pace of culture is always evolving based on new artifacts of music and literature and language and all these different expressions. And so brands are going to have to realize that their power in the future isn't going to come from their ability to push messaging endlessly, repetitiously at someone. That's not what brand value meaning is going to come from. It's going to come from people who surround the brand, that's in that tribe of users or communities, talking to each other, motivating each other, connecting with each other. And so a brand's role is fundamentally changing, and it's changing to be more of an enabler of lifestyle, enabler of quality of life. And I think some of the brands that have continued to grow the fastest, when we look at fast growing companies, are in that growth mode because they realize that what they mean to a community is they need to give that community value. And that's more than just selling them something and leaving them with that product or service, but letting people kind of turbocharge that ecosystem of traditions and norms and customs all around the product and brand. So the role of a brand's changing, and where brand goals going to come from is going to change. And it's going to come down to a choice, in my view.
Oh, absolutely. Courtney, again, you get the last word. What marketing strategies and best practices would you advise companies and brands in this very polarizing time? And again, when it comes to, they don't want to alienate certain groups, but they do want to empower and remain committed, or at least look like they're committed to empowering marginalized groups.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Selena. I think there's two parts to it. The first part is really empowering their internal stakeholders. So employees are really the brand's first line of defense. They are going to be the true brand ambassadors. So what consumers are looking at is how are employees being treated internally. So that's going to be the first thing. And I know that a lot of companies have ERGs, employee resource groups, and business resource groups. And those brands inside of those many collectives within these different brands, they're feeling like their voices are being heard amongst one another. But now brands are going to be required to merge those different resource groups and have those conversations. So it's not just Black people talking to Black people. It's not just women talking to women. It's really a collective, and it's an open forum for people to really feel like they're being heard, not just in their own group, but outside of the groups. I think that that's step number one. I think step number two is making sure that the brands that are creating these the different advertisements, they really have to tap on the shoulders of brands, multicultural audience, multicultural marketing and ad agencies so that they can get it right. There's no harm in partnership, and a lot of brands are going to continue to miss that mark if they don't tap on the shoulders of these brands and these businesses that's really their sector and that's really their focus, because they're going to continue to have these mishaps. And I think the third thing that brands need to do is really put their money where their mouth is, not just talk about it, but really have that policy, that those reforms that are going to happen internally and externally. And that happens in what they're supporting, that happens in their imagery on their Instagram feeds, on their website. And it's really going to come down it has to come from the top down. It can't come from the supplier diversity department. It can't come from the one Black employee. It has to really come from leadership. And that's going to come in the form of diversifying your board. That's going to come in the form of hiring C-suite people who are diverse. And that's really what's going to matter. And that's where brands should start.
Absolutely. Kai, how can people find and connect with you and also tap into the work that you're doing?
Sure. And thank you for the opportunity. I love connecting with individuals. Please follow Blacklist 100. You can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And every single day, we champion a different change maker. And we have a lot of content and research and things that we put out in order to make sure that Black voices and executives and creators and activists and individuals can be accessible to brands, for them to hire, for them to cast, for them to bring in as advisors, put in creative campaigns, for anything, so that we can really move beyond the notion that there's not individuals ready with the message. And so that's at Blacklist 100. And if anyone wants to follow me on LinkedIn, I generally talk about research as it relates to DE&I and as it relates to branding and communication, and really about community building. And you can just follow me there.
Courtney, how can we find and connect with you and also see your work?
Well, first and foremost, I've had so much fun with you, Selena, and you, Kai. This has been so fun. So thank you for having me. I'm really active on LinkedIn, so you all feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I also have the Future Proof podcast, which is all around multicultural, millennial, and Gen Z marketing and branding. I have a Facebook group as well, but you can find access to all of that stuff at CourtneyNewell.com or my company website, which is crownedmc.com.
So thank you two so much. We gained a wealth of knowledge and insight from this discussion. And I just want to thank you again and let everyone know that if you don't get anything else, I just want to leave you with this. Change starts now. It starts with us. It starts with using our voices, our dollars, our platforms to demand the change that we want to see. And we do see the corporate landscape actually changing. And I think that everyone can be a change agent and everyone does have a role in this. So remember, stay informed, educated, and empowered, and we will see the change that we need. So thank you again.